It's as pretty as I'm gonna get.
It's all good.
All right. What we got for today? Closure.
The elusive concept of closure. Let's talk about it because it affects so many people. In fact, there's probably an element of needing closure with every relationship, really, isn't there? But sometimes it's a lot harder to get hold of. And I think when that is happening, it's because people don't realize that the closure needs to come from them. So that was why I talk about it. It's something I've struggled with personally, and it's something I'm actually helping someone with at the moment, a client that I'm coaching. I thought it was a really good one to talk about because a lot of people struggle. So what are your thoughts around closure?
I think you hit the nail on the head as far as like
Yeah.
waiting for something to come to you, a sign or some other person, or
Yeah.
it also gets me to start thinking about the negative coping mechanisms, right? So the drugs and alcohol and replacing that void with something. And ultimately, we're the only ones that can save us. And we're the only ones that can get us ourselves through it. For me, and probably for most people, it's frustrating when it doesn't happen quicker. And so it's a process, and it's a long one, and nobody knows how long it's going to take. I'm dealing with a very close family member who recently lost their spouse to death, and she's frustrated because she doesn't know. Her expectation was 18 months ago when he passed away, she should be good by now, but where'd that expectation come from?
Yeah.
And there's no timeline for how long these things can take. So divorce is no different, for sure.
And I'm glad you mentioned that because that's actually a really important connection that I made that is helpful when you're trying to look for closure from somebody else. If you look at death, there is no closure. You cannot go to that person to ask for closure. You have to find it within yourself. That's a lesson. So it might take a while, but that is your only option. Whereas with the end of a relationship, we have this magical thinking. If I could just go to them and have this one conversation, then I'll be able to put a full stop and move on. But the problem with that is that you don't know where that's going to lead. It can go to so many different areas. The one conversation can actually set you off into all these different tangents in your head. So that is the problem with trying to reach for someone else to give you this closure rather than finding it yourself. I wanted to break closure down into sort of two umbrellas almost. So there's the closure you need if you need to be forgiven. You're guilty. You feel like you just need this person to forgive you for all the wrongs you've done, and it's holding you stuck. And this is what was happening with this client. There was infidelity, and he couldn't forgive himself. So 7 years later, he still feels terrible. He's still telling himself he's not a great person. So there's guilt. So he wants that closure. And the other umbrella. So there's either that or there is I've been hurt so bad, and I need to know that this person is sorry for what they've done to me and knows all the pain they've caused and is really regretful, and then I can move on. So yeah, there's the two different types of closure that people look for, really. Am I missing a third type of closure? I had a really good
Well, it's interesting because as you saw me scramble here, I ran and got my notepad, and I literally wrote down, you probably can't see it, it's all blurred out, but acceptance and forgiveness. Yeah. Literally, it comes down to those two things. And I think from my marriage, there's a bit of both. Well, I guess in all divorce, to your point, there's the acceptance of what it is and forgiveness of either yourself in your client's case or in your former spouse. And we've talked a lot. I can't remember which episode it was, but it takes two. Yeah. And so for me, there's a lot of things that I did in the marriage or didn't do in the marriage that probably led to the reasons that it fell apart. And so I have to be accepting of that responsibility. I have to accept the outcome. Ultimately, it's over. Literally, the marriage is over. That whole chapter in your life is over. If it happened in the past, we have no control over it. There's nothing we can do about it. Yeah. And so we have to accept that as this is our reality. Be self-aware, be honest with yourself. It hurts. There is some guilt. There is some shame. There is some, I wish I could do this over again. If you have children, in both of our case, there's still a relationship that has to be had, at least till the kids are 18, I guess. There has to be healthy dialogue along the way. And so I guess in the case of death, depending on where you land spiritually, there's a one-way conversation, maybe a two-way conversation, but in a divorce, especially with children, there's still an ongoing dialogue, and there's still a relationship there. And so that opens up new pain. That's a reminder. Sometimes if there wasn't kids, literally, you may never have to see or talk to that person ever again. And that may be easier, maybe harder too. I don't know. There's a lot of...
Interesting. Interesting is that my client, they didn't have children. So 7 years ago, that happened, no children. He doesn't know where she is now. He wants to track her down and have a conversation. So that's fine. If you feel like you need a conversation, that's all good, but go in really clear. So part of what I wanted to talk about today is, if you do feel you need closure, with or without the children, I think actually makes it a little bit difficult, because there really is no closure, because like you say, it's an ongoing relationship, right? But if you don't have those ties and you think, I just need this conversation, then I can heal and move on. This person is struggling to connect with other people, has dated, has had relationships, but every time tends to sabotage because it's not like what I had, romanticizing the guilt. So also I think that has made that person romanticize the old relationship a little. So the steps I would suggest is, what do you think you're going to get from closure, and what are you anticipating? How likely is that to happen? Whether it happens or doesn't happen, can you then move on? That is kind of, if you approach your closure like that and you do a full inventory and a really good deep dive, the chances are you will end up at the end of it, maybe not, but end of it going, I'm probably not going to get any closure out of this if I actually follow the thread. So that is what I sort of wanted to talk to people about. And it's the same when you've got your kids. If you want something from your ex, are you really still carrying a lot of hurt, or you really have a lot of guilt? You're just not going to get it unless you go within. So everything that we discuss here about mindful divorce, that is about going within. And so let's talk about, you said ownership, forgiveness. Absolutely. They're the absolute two essential pillars of moving on. So closure and moving on are closely related. You cannot do one without the other. But the problem is, people think closure comes from somewhere else, and it doesn't. It comes from you. So that's probably what we can talk about more, is our own experiences of that. So where are you at with closure?
Yeah, I think this is really good. So in your client's case and in my case, the wound that was opened up by the divorce was abandonment. And so part of the spiritual healing that I've done over the last couple of weeks is, when did I first feel abandonment? The first time wasn't when I had marital issues. That was just a feeling from when I was 5 years old, from when my father first abandoned me. It was just reopened during the divorce. And so I would say to your client, when's the first time you felt whatever it is he's feeling, embarrassment, regret, whatever it is? In most cases, it stems, that's not the root. The root isn't when he had a extramarital affair. It's from something when he was 5 to 15 years old. And so I would say to him, do some inner child looking and some research. And rather than trying to hunt down the ex and have a conversation that they probably will find meaningless and be resentful about even having, I would, yeah, it's only going to make things worse. So find the answer within, talk to your 5-year-old or 10-year-old self when you first had that feeling, write that person a letter, have a conversation with that person, because then things come full circle, and then you ultimately heal, and then you are really ready to forgive whatever it is. In my case, I was instantly ready to forgive my ex-wife and my father within an hour. And truly, I've had no resentment, no other issues since then. I don't know what the future is going to hold, but that's how I feel today.
So you feel you've achieved this closure, you've achieved that. And so ownership, forgiveness, so you've owned it and you've forgiven yourself. Yeah, I think for me, I had a little bit of both. There was a lot of guilt, and because the other thing that we do is we find ways to feel guilty. We find ways that we were to blame, if that's kind of the pathway that our brain will take us down sometimes. So it's letting go of guilt, accepting I'm not perfect, I never will be perfect, but as long as I sort of had the best intentions to try to make something work, what more can I ask of myself? Then again, I also felt like terribly hurt by somebody and felt like I just needed to have this one conversation so that that person could understand my hurt, etc. And then I would feel better. And I just got to this place not that long ago, considering how long I have been on this kind of journey of going within and ownership, forgiveness. And I realized it really doesn't matter whether or not I go to get this closure. It isn't going to make any difference, because no matter what that person says, if I don't have the belief inside myself that, hey, it's over and I can move on, I won't anyway. But a really useful tool, this is if someone is going through this and they need a tool, I think, I call it dismantling the fantasy. So you have this fantasy conversation you're going to have where everything gets cleared up and now I can move on. Now I've had that conversation. So dismantle it, break it down, literally write it down. What are you going to do? I'll call them, I'll drive to this cafe, whatever. They might be somewhere else. Yep. What are you going to say? I'll say this, this, and this. What do you think they'll say back? They'll say this maybe, or they might say this. Or God, they might actually say this. How's that going to feel if they say that horrible, scary thing? Oh shit, then I'm going to obsess again. So I knew when I did that, I was like, even if I have a conversation, the chances are that person might say something to me that's actually going to set off my rumination, obsessing, and I'll be back to square one. So once I kind of dismantled all that big fantasy and the likelihood of what I would hear, the likelihood of, am I going to get this perfect dialogue that I just really need to hear? Probably not. So, and that was kind of the blockage shifting for me. That was that big aha moment where I went, it doesn't matter. And then I just started to feel a lot better and achieve what I consider to be closure. Whereas I don't think about it. When I do, it's very quick. I just, yep, that's done. Let's move on. There's other things to think about. And I think anyone who's struggling with closure, that's what they're talking about. Would you agree? It's that ruminating, looping thoughts, can't get it out of your head, cycling through blame, then guilt, then blame, then guilt. And then the bigger issue, trying to move on and love and be loved again. And because you keep self-sabotaging or you can't connect for some reason, you're scared, can't open up. So that's where the stuck blockages come from. So
I love all of that. And so for me, this lands on what we talked about, or maybe we were texting about earlier this week about crawl, walk, run. And so there's a process with all of these things that the person is going to have to go through. And then ultimately where they're going to land on, where I landed on, is that everything happens for a reason. The more I try to seek an answer or catch up to that person or whatever it is that I'm trying to do, and not allowing the world and just whatever it is, karma, whatever it is you believe in, the more I try to force it, the less it's going to happen. And so coming back to your client, what I would say to him is, if you are meant to have a conversation with this X, it will happen. But there is a 0% chance that it's going to happen because you traveled the world and tracked down that person and made any effort. It's going to happen by coincidence if you believe in coincidence. And I would argue that if it happens again, there is a reason that that's happening. And the things that you've been thinking about over the last 7 years and fantasizing about in your head that you would say to that person, none of those things are going to get said. And you have no idea how that conversation is going to go. I can tell you from experience, and not from my relationship, but with my father. I went 5 to 10 years without talking to him. And I've fantasized about, if he died today, would I even go to his funeral? What would I say to him? What would I think? All these things. And now I can call him and I can tell him I love him because things played out the way that they were supposed to play out, not the way that I wanted them to. At the end of the day, you just got to let go. Easier said than done. Did I lose you, or there you're back?
Yeah, because I just lost the sound.
Could you hear me or no?
No, it goes completely silent.
I'll do a quick, at the end of the day, it's really about letting go and allowing things to happen the way that they're supposed to happen. And the more that we fantasize about things and try to force something to happen, the less likely it is to happen. And you have to allow that energy and that space inside of you to really flourish and just let things go.
And I think it's also giving yourself that permission to, if you feel at the end of your inventory, this is what I said, if you still feel you've done all of that and you still feel like you need the conversation, well, maybe the conversation will give you the data you need to say, okay, I did or I didn't. And either way, that could be for you the clearing of the blockage. Like I had that conversation, it really cut and I'm back to square one, but at least now it's done. So it's just always with everything I say to anybody with these types of dilemmas or emotional blockages, it's just go in mindful, go in really aware of what you're doing, you know, not just driven on autopilot. I just need to talk. I could tell when I could see it in myself when I was talking to him. I went, it's reminding me of me, you know. I just need to. And then so sometimes I also will start the sentence and get that person to finish it. I just need to have the conversation, and then sometimes it's kind of like, oh yeah, I don't even know past there. I just know I need to have this conversation. That's all. So go in mindful, take the steps, reflect, really think about what you want the outcome to be, the likelihood of how you're going to get, and then if you need to have it, go for it, you know. And if it was, you come out of it and go, well, that was a fail, all good, forgive yourself, you know, it's okay. Life is learning, life is lessons. So
this is really an interesting conversation, because I just thought of something that I had not thought about, like probably in a year or two.
Okay.
And so quick story, I was married, but before I was married, I had a girlfriend for probably a year or two. And I got into some legal, I was 20 years old. I got into some legal trouble. I was with other girls, you know, whatever it is. It didn't work out between her and I.
Yeah.
But I had this fantasy in my mind of like, man, she was the one. And I was married for 12 years. And subconsciously, I felt like at times, am I married to the wrong person? Was I supposed to marry that other girl?
Yeah.
Lo and behold, I get divorced. I connect with that other girl on social media. I think we went to dinner one night, but ultimately, like, there was nothing there. And so what that tells you is like, all right, your mind plays tricks on you. First of all, your mind plays tricks on you, and you start to fantasize and tell yourself stories about things that should have been, could have been, would have been, but they're not, and it's never going to be.
Yeah.
Second thing is people change. And that person that I knew 20 years ago and who I was 20 years ago are completely different people today, for the better. But we're not compatible. There's no love. There's no spark. There's no nothing. But I definitely had closure from going to that dinner. And I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but if I had some podcast like this 2 years ago, maybe I would have listened to this and said, you know what? I shouldn't even be talking to her. I shouldn't even entertain this dinner. And I would have saved myself probably $60 from a beer. And
so sometimes it can work. I think the difference there, when I'm listening to you talk, I think the difference there is you were able to move on, have another relationship with your ex-wife. So you were not emotionally blocked by that. It was just kind of like more of a, I wonder, she was pretty cool. You know, those old nostalgic feelings we have about our exes all the time. Like, I think everybody can think of fun, nostalgic feelings about an ex, because you must have had some fun at some point. Otherwise,
for sure,
together. So that type of interaction is probably, quite good to give you just to sort of like, okay, tick that box, that one's gone, I can stop thinking about that now. I think versus that sort of really heavy ruminating, can't move on, can't connect, can't start new relationships. So it's good to look at the differences there, because some people might think, it's not going to hurt if I just call the old ex up, see what he's doing, she's doing. No, it's not going to hurt. And it might actually give you, I had the same thing with you. I caught up with an old ex after my divorce, and oh God, it was hilarious, and I was glad I did it. And it was one of those scratch your head moments, like, was I really with you? Holy shit. And it actually shows you how much you've grown and changed. So it can be a positive thing. It can be a positive experience. Yeah.
Absolutely agree. And as we're talking about this, I think most of the closure that I was looking for in my marriage, I probably got the day that I determined that the marriage was over. Like, we went through a separation and trying to reconcile things for probably a year and a half. And for me, it was as simple as flipping a light switch. Like, I'm done. The marriage is over. We're moving on. There's no looking back. This is plan A, and there is no plan B. This is what we're doing.
I was the same with my marriage, because I think with a marriage it's different. I've always said, and I think you'll probably agree, nobody walks away from a marriage lightly. It is one of the heaviest, deepest decisions. So if you're doing that, the chances are you're pretty aware there's no more there's no end of that road. But yes, you will try to reconcile. And actually, on that note, I think that's a really good one. I would love to explore that on our next session, is that reconciliation period that many have. You have your divorce, but then everybody I have spoken to has that period where they try again. So it'd be quite good to have a chat about our experiences with that part of divorce, that leaving and then that hesitating, trying to make it work again, because it's an interesting time, that one. That is the crawl of the crawl, walk, run, actually, because you're crawling, man. You're on your knees at that point. Okay?